Okay, so have you ever stopped and thought about this? Literally every single thing that's alive, like even the tiniest little bacteria, they all need energy to actually, well, do anything at all.
Right.
It's kind of mind-blowing. And for all you GCSE biology folks out there, this is one of the most important things to wrap your head around.
Yeah, I mean, think about it, the plant growing up towards the sun, or even just, like how you're focusing right now and listening to us talk.
Right.
All of that boils down to this incredible movement and change of energy inside living things.
Yeah.
We call this energetics in biology.
That's a pretty cool word, energetics.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we're going to focus on two super important processes, photosynthesis and respiration.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like, I don't know, two sides of the same coin. Both are essential for how life manages its energy, wouldn't you say?
Totally. And our mission today, if you will, is to understand just how plants, like they use sunlight to make their own food. It's kind of like a magic trick when you think about it.
Yeah, it really is.
And then we're going to explore how all living things, and that includes plants, unlock that stored energy in food to do, well, all the things they need to do to survive.
So first up, let's shed some light on photosynthesis. This is that incredible process where plants are basically like these little solar-powered chefs whipping up glucose, their own sugary fuel, using light energy.
Exactly. And it's important to remember here that photosynthesis, this whole process, is what we call an endothermic reaction.
Endothermic.
Yeah, so that endo part there.
Mm-hmm.
That basically means in, so it needs an energy input from its surroundings, and in this case, that input is light. Think of it like, you need to plug in a lamp to make it work, right? Same idea.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just happening magically out of thin air. It needs that light energy to kick things off.
Exactly, and there's this really handy chemical equation that sums up the whole process. Carbon dioxide plus water, those react together to make glucose and oxygen. Or, if you prefer the chemical symbols, QO plus HERO, and those transform into CHERO plus OO.
Right. Yeah, and I think what always blows my mind here is that the oxygen we breathe, like the very air that keeps us going, that's actually just a side effect, a byproduct of plants making their food.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? We rely on plants for the oxygen we breathe, and they just kind of, produce it as they go about their business. It really shows just how interconnected life on Earth truly is. But it's not just, a constant rate at which this photosynthesis happens.
Right.
It's not just like on or off.
Yeah.
There are actually different things that can make it go faster or slower. So first, let's talk about temperature.
Temperature. Now, I know this has something to do with those little helpers, the enzymes, right?
Yeah, good memory. So enzymes are like these special proteins. They really speed up chemical reactions in living things. And in photosynthesis, well, as the temperature goes up, the enzymes generally get more efficient, they work better. So that means that the rate of glucose production increases.
Like things are moving faster in the plant kitchen.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But there's a catch. If it gets too hot, those enzymes can actually start to change shape. Just like an egg, when you cook it for too long,
Oh, yeah.
it goes all weird and solid. So when enzymes change shape like that, they stop working properly. We call that denaturing.
Denaturing.
Yeah, and that can really slow things down or even bring the whole photosynthesis process to a grinding halt.
So temperature is super important then.
It is. Not too hot, not too cold. Got to be just right for those enzyme chefs.
Like Goldilocks. So what about light intensity? How does that play a role?
Well, think of it this way. For most plants, the more light they soak up, the more energy they have to make glucose. Right?
That makes sense.
Like, think about having more solar panels on your roof. You're going to generate more electricity.
More power.
Exactly. So usually, higher light intensity leads to a faster rate of photosynthesis.
Okay, so more light, more food for the plant. Got it. Now, carbon dioxide, that's something we hear a lot about these days. How does that fit into all of this?
Carbon dioxide
Yeah.
is actually one of the key ingredients in that recipe for glucose, if you remember that equation.
Oh, yeah.
It's right there. So if there's more KRO in the air around the plant, the rate of photosynthesis can also increase, but only up to a certain point. It's kind of like having more flour when you're baking a cake. You could potentially make a bigger cake, but only if you have enough of all the other ingredients too.
Makes sense. And lastly, what about the amount of chlorophyll?
Right, chlorophyll.
That's the green stuff in leaves, right? What does that do?
It is. Chlorophyll is the pigment that actually captures that light energy. It's like the solar panel itself. So if a plant doesn't have enough chlorophyll,
What happens then?
well, it might not be getting enough magnesium from the soil. And that's important because it's a vital component of chlorophyll.
Oh, okay.
So if there's not enough chlorophyll, the plant can't absorb as much light. Simple as that. And that means the rate of photosynthesis is going to be lower.
So it's like having a less efficient solar panel.
Pretty much.
So we've talked about all these factors that affect photosynthesis, but how do scientists actually measure how fast it's happening? You can't really, see the sugar being
You
made.
can't just look at it, no. But scientists are clever. They've come up with some pretty ingenious ways to figure this out.
Oh, tell me more.
So a really common method involves pondweed. You basically put some pondweed in a sealed tube filled with water. Now this tube is connected to this very thin glass tube, a capillary tube, which is also filled with water, and that tube is attached to a syringe.
Okay, I'm trying to picture all this.
And then you shine a lamp at it, at the pondweed, from a specific distance.
Okay, and then what happens?
Well, as the pondweed is doing its photosynthesis thing, it releases oxygen gas. That's a byproduct, remember?
Oh, yeah?
And this oxygen, it forms a tiny bubble in that thin glass tube. And by measuring how far that bubble moves over a set amount of time, you can actually work out the volume of oxygen produced.
Oh, that's really clever.
Yeah, it's a sneaky way of measuring something you can't see directly.
So the more oxygen produced, the faster the photosynthesis is happening.
Exactly. And you can even tweak the experiment a bit.
Oh, how so?
Well, you can investigate how different factors affect the rate. You could change the temperature of the water, for instance, that the pondweed's sitting in.
Oh, interesting.
You could record how much oxygen is produced over different time periods, or you could play around with the light intensity, by moving that lamp closer or further away. But here's the key. In any experiment like this, you have to make sure you're only changing one thing at a time. Everything else has to stay exactly the same.
Why is that so important?
Because if you see a change in the amount of oxygen being produced, you want to be sure it's actually due to the thing you're changing and not something else.
That makes total sense. You've got to isolate the variable, right? So what happens if one of these factors, like light or temperature, isn't at the optimal level? That's where the concept of a limiting factor comes in, doesn't it?
Yeah, you got it. A limiting factor. Think of it like this. Imagine a busy highway. You've got multiple lanes, but one of them is super slow, right?
Oh, I hate when that happens.
Doesn't matter how fast the other lanes are moving, the overall flow of traffic is going to be held back by that one slow lane.
Makes you want to just merge into that lane and tell everyone to speed up.
I know, right? But anyway, in photosynthesis, a limiting factor is like that slow lane. It's an environmental condition that's just not at a good level, and it prevents the rate of photosynthesis from increasing, even if you boost all the other factors.
So it's like a bottleneck.
Exactly. And we can actually see this on a graph. Imagine a graph where light intensity, the brightness of the light, is on one axis, and the rate of photosynthesis is on the other axis.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
Now, if light intensity is the limiting factor, the line on the graph might go up really steeply at first as the light gets brighter.
Okay.
But then it'll flatten out or it'll plateau. That shows that even if you crank up the light even more, the rate of photosynthesis isn't going to increase anymore.
Because something else has become the bottleneck.
Right. Something else has become the limiting factor. It could be the amount of Kuro or the temperature or something like that.
Yeah.
But if you increase that other factor, you'll likely see the rate start to climb again.
So on a graph comparing, say, 50 lux and 100 lux, which is just how we measure light intensity,
Right.
the line for 50 lux might level off sooner than the 100 lux line.
Exactly. That means that at 50 lux, the light itself was holding back the rate of photosynthesis.
Got it. So it's all about finding that sweet spot where everything's working together. And this whole idea of limiting factors, it's got real-world applications too, right? I'm thinking about those massive greenhouses where they grow all sorts of fruits and veggies.
You're exactly right. Those growers use their knowledge of limiting factors to control the conditions inside those greenhouses. They keep the temperature just right, make sure there's plenty of light, and sometimes they even pump in extra CO euro. By carefully managing these factors, they create the perfect environment for photosynthesis to just go wild. Faster growth, bigger harvests, everybody wins.
Wow, so it's like they're optimizing the plant's world. Now, I also remember reading about this thing called the inverse square law, which has to do with light. It sounds a bit like physics to me.
It is. It's a physics principle, but it's super relevant to biology too, especially when we're talking about photosynthesis. Think of a flashlight beam, right? When you hold it close to a wall, The light is really intense, bright, and focused.
Right.
But as you move that flashlight further away, the same amount of light is now spread out over a much larger area, so it gets dimmer. The inverse square law basically says that the intensity of the light decreases by the square of the distance.
Okay, so what does that actually mean for our plants?
Well, let's say you double the distance between a light source, like a grow lamp, and a plant.
Okay.
The light intensity hitting that plant doesn't just halve, it actually drops to 1/4 of what it was.
Whoa, so even a small change in distance can make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that we've talked about how plants make glucose, let's think about what they actually do with it. It's not like they just use it all up right away, right?
Nope, plants are super smart about how they manage their energy.
They are.
So, first of all, some of the glucose is used right away for respiration. That's what we're going to talk about next.
Right.
That process gives the plant energy for growth and all its other important life processes. But plants are also great at saving energy for later, aren't they?
Absolutely. They convert some of that glucose into insoluble starch, which they can store in different parts of the plant. The roots, the stems, the leaves.
Like little energy savings account.
Exactly. And they can tap into those stores later on when photosynthesis might be slower, like at night or during the winter.
And I also remember reading that glucose can be turned into fats and oils.
Yes, that's especially true for seeds. Think about sunflower seeds or peanuts, all those yummy oils they contain. That's a super concentrated energy store for the young plant when it starts to grow.
It's like packing a lunch for the baby plant. Now, what about the structure of the plant itself? Like its cell walls, they're pretty sturdy. How do they do that?
That's where cellulose comes in. So glucose molecules can actually be joined together in a different way to make cellulose. And that's the main building block of plant cell walls. It provides strength and support, like the scaffolding of the plant.
Makes sense. And finally, I also read something about glucose combining with nitrates. What's that all about?
Right, so to build proteins, which are essential for growth and enzymes, plants need amino acids. And they can actually make these amino acids by combining glucose with nitrate ions, which they absorb from the soil through their roots.
So it's like a partnership between the plant and the soil.
Exactly. Those nitrate ions, they come from the soil, and then the plant combines them with the glucose from photosynthesis to make amino acids. And then those amino acids are linked together to form the proteins the plant needs.
Wow, so plants are basically these incredible little energy conversion machines, taking sunlight and turning it into food and all these other things they need to thrive. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Okay, time to shift gears now and talk about respiration. We know animals respire, but plants do it too, right?
Absolutely. Every single living cell, whether it's a plant, an animal, a fungus, or a bacteria, does respiration. It's how we all release the energy that's locked up in glucose so we can actually use it to do all the things we need to do.
So it's like accessing the energy bank.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And unlike photosynthesis, which needs energy, respiration actually releases energy. So we call it an exothermic reaction. Think of exo meaning out, or exit, like energy exiting the glucose molecule.
Okay, so energy is going out, not in. Got it. And I know there are two main types of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic. What's the difference?
The big difference is all about oxygen. Aerobic respiration needs oxygen to work, and it's the most efficient way to extract energy from glucose. It produces a lot of usable energy compared to the other type. And most of the reactions involved in aerobic respiration, they happen in these tiny structures within our cells called mitochondria.
Mitochondria, I've heard of those.
Yeah, they're often called the powerhouses of the cell, for good reason.
So what does the chemical equation look like for aerobic respiration?
It's actually like the reverse of photosynthesis. Glucose plus oxygen reacts to become carbon dioxide plus water. So in chemical symbols, that's C-A-euro, O-euro plus O-yo, transforming into co-euro plus H-er. So we breathe in oxygen, and then we breathe out carbon dioxide and water vapor as waste products.
So oxygen in, carbon dioxide, and water out. Okay, I can remember that. But what about anaerobic respiration? When does that come into play?
Anaerobic respiration happens when there just isn't enough oxygen around.
Like when we're exercising really hard?
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit of a backup system. Think about sprinting. Your muscles are working so hard, they need so much energy that your lungs might not be able to get enough oxygen to them fast enough.
So what happens in our muscles when they're doing anaerobic respiration?
Well, in animals, glucose is broken down without oxygen and produces lactic acid. And that buildup of lactic acid in your muscles is what causes that burning feeling you get during intense exercise.
Oh yeah, I definitely know that feeling. You know, that muscle burn. It's not very pleasant, but I guess it's just our bodies doing their best to keep up. So anaerobic respiration in us produces lactic acid, but what about plants and yeast? Is it the same for them?
It's slightly different. In plants and yeast cells, anaerobic respiration is also called fermentation. And instead of lactic acid, it produces ethanol, which is a type of alcohol, and carbon dioxide.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're making their own little brewery inside their cells.
You could say that. And this process is actually really important to us humans. It's how yeast makes bread rise, all those air pockets in bread. That's from the carbon dioxide gas produced during fermentation.
That's amazing. And of course, it's how we make alcoholic drinks too, thanks to the ethanol. So our fluffy bread and our beer, we owe it all to anaerobic respiration in yeast. Biology is pretty cool. Now, going back to exercise, there's this thing called oxygen debt, right?
Yeah, oxygen debt. So when you've been exercising hard and your body's had to rely on that anaerobic respiration backup system, you've built up some lactic acid. Oxygen debt is basically the extra oxygen your body needs after you stop exercising to deal with all that lactic acid and get everything back to normal. That's why you keep breathing heavily, even after you finish a run or a workout. You're repaying that oxygen debt.
So we're catching our breath and getting rid of that lactic acid at the same time. But how does our body actually get rid of it? Does it just like disappear?
Not quite. It gets transported away by your blood. So your blood carries the lactic acid to your liver. And in the liver, it's converted back into glucose. But this process, this conversion, it needs oxygen, which is why it's so important to keep breathing deeply even after you've stopped exercising.
Okay, so we've talked about photosynthesis, where plants capture energy, and respiration, where all living things release energy. But there's a bigger picture here, isn't there? This is where metabolism comes in, right?
Exactly. Metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions that are happening inside a cell or inside your whole body. Think of it like this massive, intricate network of processes that are constantly working together to keep us alive and functioning. And the energy that's released during respiration, that's the fuel that powers all those metabolic reactions, especially the ones that involve building new molecules.
So it's like respiration provides the energy currency that our bodies use for all sorts of transactions.
Perfect. And all these reactions, they're controlled by those trusty enzymes we talked about before.
Right, those little helpers are everywhere.
They're essential. Enzymes speed up these reactions, make sure everything's happening at the right rate. Without them, life as we know it just wouldn't be possible.
Hmm.
Do you want some examples of metabolic reactions in action?
Yeah, give me some concrete examples.
All right, so remember how plants turn glucose into starch to store it away? That's a metabolic process.
Yeah.
They're basically linking lots of individual glucose molecules together. Or think about when we build up our fat reserves.
Yeah.
That involves glycerol and fatty acids joining up to form lipids, and that's another example of metabolism. And remember, when plants combine glucose with those nitrate ions they get from the soil to create amino acids, which then form proteins, Right. all of those are all vital metabolic reactions. And even respiration itself is a key part of metabolism, as is the process of breaking down proteins and forming urea, which our bodies need to get rid of.
So metabolism is basically this incredible complex web of reactions, all fueled by energy from respiration, which ultimately can be traced back to the sun and photosynthesis. It's all connected.
You got it. It's this beautiful cycle. Photosynthesis takes sunlight and converts it into energy in the form of glucose. And then respiration releases that energy so all these metabolic processes can take place, keeping everything alive, growing, and functioning. It's truly remarkable.
All right, let's do a quick recap. Today, we went deep into how plants use photosynthesis to capture light energy, make their own food in the form of glucose, and release that precious oxygen that we all need. We looked at all the factors that can affect photosynthesis, like temperature, light intensity, and carbon dioxide, and even saw how that knowledge is applied in the real world, like in those giant greenhouses.
Yeah.
Then we explored respiration, both the aerobic kind that uses oxygen and the anaerobic kind that's our backup system.
Yep.
And we saw how all living things use respiration to unlock the energy in glucose to power everything they do.
And don't forget the link between these two processes. The glucose produced in photosynthesis, that's the fuel for respiration in almost all living things, including plants themselves. It's a fantastic example of how different biological processes are all linked together.
It's all about teamwork.
Exactly.
This has been a really fascinating look into the world of energy in living things. It really makes you appreciate the amazing complexity and efficiency of life.
It does. It really does. And here's something for you to think about. How might all this connect to other things you're learning about in biology? For example, How could changes in our environment, like rising carbon dioxide levels or increasing global temperatures, how could those changes affect photosynthesis and respiration? What might that mean for different ecosystems and the balance of nature? Some pretty big questions there.
Big questions indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of energetics. We hope you've enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And until next time, keep exploring the incredible science that's all around you.